The wind didn't howl. It whispered. Through the cracked wooden shutters of a dim farmhouse, something stirred. Cough, dry, sharp, then silence. The old man lay slumped in his worn-out chair, thin fingers clutching a crumpled photo. His lips trembled but spoke no words. In the hallway, a young man in a crisp suit stepped inside, shoulders stiff, eyes darting. "Grandpa!" he called, but his voice cracked. No reply. Just the ticking of a crooked wall clock and the slow creak of old wood settling. Then came the thud, sudden and hollow. The old man collapsed forward, photo slipping from his grasp. The young man ran to him, but it was too late. A scream ripped through the stillness. "No, not now, not like this," he sobbed. But the old farmer's eyes never opened again. On the back of the photo were 6 words, scrawled shakily in pencil. Most people never stop being unhappy. The house hadn't heard a cry in years. Not since the day his grandmother died. Now it echoed with sorrow again. The young man, Jacob, sat beside the lifeless body, unsure if he should call someone or just sit and breathe. His throat burned, his heart numb, but this wasn't how their last visit was supposed to end. "You waited all this time," Jacob whispered, brushing dust off the old man's shoulder. The photo lay face up now. He picked it up. It was a younger version of his grandfather, standing beside a woman and a child. But Jacob didn't recognize the child. Not himself. Not anyone he'd ever seen. Behind it, that strange message. Jacob's fingers traced the faded words. "Most people never stop being unhappy." His brow furrowed. Why would his grandfather die with that in hand? What had he meant? Who was the child? Jacob stood and paced, trying to make sense of it all. His gaze caught the mantel, cluttered with relics, rusted tools, dusty books, and faded frames. Memories or warnings. He picked up a cracked photo frame. Same woman. Different child. Again, not him. His heart pounded. Was this a mistake? Then his eyes landed on the old cabinet. Locked. He remembered this cabinet from when he was a child. His grandfather had once said, "What's behind that door will either free you or finish you." Back then, it felt like a joke. Now, it didn't. Driven by something he couldn't name. Fear, desperation, love? He rummaged for the key. Finally, beneath a loose floorboard he found it. Small, rusted, warm. He stood before the cabinet, key in hand. The moment thickened. His hand trembled as he reached toward the lock. The key slid in with a reluctant click. The cabinet creaked open, exhaling dust and silence. Inside, not riches, not relics, but letters. Dozens. 10. All addressed to people Jacob had never heard of. Some unopened. Some returned marked, "Deceased, no such address, returned to sender." Each envelope bore the same scrawl, trembling cursive, sorrow soaked into every line. He pulled one open. Inside, a letter to a woman named Elsie. "I tried to be the man you believed I was," it read. "But life kept reminding me I wasn't." Jacob sat down hard. Who was Elsie? A lover? A child? A lie? This wasn't grief. This was revelation. A quiet storm, unfurling. His grandfather hadn't just died. He had collapsed under the weight of truths buried too long. Jacob pressed the letter to his chest and looked at his grandfather again. "Who were you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Then he noticed it, a small wooden box tucked behind the letters. He pulled it out. Inside was a cassette tape. Unmarked, but for the single word etched in ink. Why? His fingers shook as he held it. In a world of emails and voice notes, who still used these? But Jacob knew. His grandfather did. Always analog. Always hiding. In the back room stood an old player, coated in dust. He placed the tape inside and pressed play. The hiss of old tape filled the room. Then came his grandfather's voice, cracked, weary but piercing. If you're hearing this, then I've gone, and it means you're ready to hear the truth. About me. About me. About why most people stay unhappy. The voice on the tape was more than just sound. It was memory reanimated. I know you're angry, it said. And confused. I would be too. Jacob sat frozen, the room around him no longer a space but a museum of hidden truths. You thought I was just a bitter, broken man, the voice continued. But you didn't know what broke me. I let love die in silence. I let pride build walls. And I buried more than just dreams on this land. Jacob leaned forward, hands clasped tight. The voice cracked, not from age, but emotion. You were never supposed to find that photo, or the letters. But if you did, it means it's time. Time to learn what was taken, and what I chose not to fight for. Jacob's heart thudded like thunder behind ribs of guilt. This wasn't just about an old man dying. This was about a man who never truly lived. Jacob paused the tape and looked around the room like seeing it for the first time. Every scar on the wall, every creak in the floor, they weren't just flaws. They were fingerprints. You were never just quiet, he muttered. You were grieving. The farm had always felt like a burden. A place his grandfather clung to while the world moved on. Now it felt sacred. He stood and walked through the kitchen, the smell of old wood and rusted metal greeting him like ghosts. A photo on the fridge, young grandpa in uniform, smiling beside a woman with fire in her eyes. Elsie? He whispered her name like a spell. Beneath it a note, some stories need silence to grow roots. Jacob pressed his palm to it. This wasn't about inheritance. It was about inheritance of pain, and whether it would stop with him. He resumed the tape. Her name was Elsie, the old voice said. And she was everything I was too afraid to fight for. We were supposed to run away, start new. But I stayed, for the land, for my father's pride. She left. I let her. The words hit like stones. She wrote me once a year. Every year. For 20 years. The tape hissed. I never wrote back. I read them. Then burned them. Jacob flinched. And that little girl in the photo, she wasn't yours, she was mine. Elsie's and mine, but I never met her. Never held her. Silence. Then the voice cracked again. My son, if you're hearing this, it means I finally told someone the truth. Jacob's stomach dropped. My son? The tape ended with a soft click. Jacob stared forward, everything inside him unraveling. I'm not his grandson, he whispered. I'm his son. He staggered backward like the truth had shoved him. All the memories, every time he was called boy, every moment his grandfather showed him how to mend a fence, sharpen a blade, plant straight rows. It all replayed now under a new light. It wasn't mentorship. It was masked fatherhood. Jacob stumbled outside, lungs gasping for air too thick to breathe. The farm stretched before him, wide, vast and suddenly heavy with meaning. A part of him wanted to run. Another part wanted to scream. But he did neither. Instead he fell to his knees in the dirt where they used to garden together. His tears hit the soil like rain. Why didn't you just tell me, he sobbed. But silence answered. The wind moved like a sigh, and the fields swayed with secrets too old to confess out loud. Later that evening, Jacob sat on the porch his grandfather built with his own hands. The boards creaked beneath his weight. In his lap sat the wooden box, now empty except for one final slip of paper. Folded tight. He opened it. A handwritten message. Most people stay unhappy because they carry truths they were never brave enough to tell. He read it again. And again. Then he tucked it in his jacket, stood, and looked out at the land. This wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of choices, bad ones, cowardly ones, and the chance to stop them from repeating. Jacob didn't know what came next. But he knew this, the silence stops with him. You were my father, he whispered into the dusk. I forgive you, but I won't live like you. The wind carried his words toward the setting sun. Jacob returned to the city, but nothing felt the same. The traffic hummed like noise without rhythm. Faces blurred past him, all rushing towards something he couldn't name. He walked into his apartment, dropped his bag, and sat in the silence. The tape still echoed in his head. She was mine, but I never held her. That truth coiled around his chest like wire. Every photograph of his childhood suddenly felt staged, incomplete. He flipped through old albums his mother left behind. She'd never spoken of his father. She always said, "It's just been you and me." But was that silence protection or punishment? Jacob clenched the letter again, the one from the wooden box, and looked into a mirror. "Who am I now?" he whispered. But the reflection offered no answers. Only a man searching for pieces of a broken past. He found her number. The only clue the tape gave. Elsie lived in Cheyenne once. With enough digging, he tracked her down. Elsie Martin, age 78, Towaway. A former schoolteacher. He dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered. Hello? It was soft. Weathered. I think I'm your grandson, Jacob said, then paused. No, I think I'm your son's son. Or maybe I'm your... Silence. Then a soft gasp. His name was Raymond, she said. But he stopped being mine long ago. Jacob felt his chest cave. I just found out. He died yesterday. Then maybe it's time, she whispered. Come see me, if you want the truth. He nodded, even though she couldn't see. I do. After the call ended, Jacob sat still. The words clung to the air like smoke. The past wasn't finished with him yet. It had just begun to speak. The drive to Cheyenne felt longer than it was. Jacob stared at the road, but his mind stayed behind, in that dusty farmhouse in those lost years. When he arrived, the house was modest. Blue siding, white trim, a garden of wilting daisies near the porch. A woman stepped out. Elsie.I. White hair, proud shoulders, eyes sharp but tired. She studied him like a ghost. You look like him, she said. No hello. No smile. Just truth. Jacob stepped forward. I didn't know until yesterday. She nodded once. Neither did she. She, your sister. The word landed like thunder. Jacob's knees almost buckled. I have a sister? Elsie opened the door without answering. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and thyme. Family photos lined the walls. But one frame was empty. She won't speak to me, Elsie said. But maybe she'll speak to you. Jacob stared at the empty picture frame, wondering whose silence hurt more, the sister's or his own. Why didn't he ever come back, he asked. Elsie sat at the kitchen table, hands folded over a cup of tea gone cold. Because shame feels heavier than love, if you let it. Her voice cracked. He thought she'd hate him. Jacob frowned. And did she? Elsie sighed. She waited. For years. Then one day, she stopped asking. A pause stretched between them, like an old bridge. What's her name? He asked. Grace. Jacob whispered it. A name meant to heal. She lives 2 blocks over. Works at the bookstore. Jacob stood. I have to try. She might not answer, Elsie warned. But I will, Jacob replied. He left the house with trembling hands and a heart full of questions. Not for his grandfather now, but for the sister he never knew he needed. Jacob pushed open the door of the bookstore, a tiny bell chiming above him. Rows of old paperbacks and the scent of ink wrapped around him like a memory not his own. Then he saw her. Early 30s. Curly dark hair, freckled cheeks, eyes sharp like his, or maybe like theirs. She glanced up and paused. The silence between them was alive. Can I help you? She asked. Jacob swallowed. Your name's Grace. She stiffened. Yes, I'm Jacob, Raymond's son. Her eyes widened. No words. No breath. Just Stillness. Then she turned away, shoulders hard. "You're too late," she said. He stepped forward. "Please. I didn't know. I only just found out." Grace stopped. "He knew," she said coldly. "He always knew." And she walked into the back, the door clicking shut. Jacob stood in the middle of stories, feeling his own slip from his hands. Jacob didn't leave the bookstore right away. He stood there long after Grace disappeared behind the door. It wasn't rejection that stung. It was recognition. Her pain mirrored his. He picked up a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath and turned it over without seeing the cover. He always knew. The words echoed. He stepped outside into the late afternoon heat, sat on a nearby bench, and stared at nothing. Elsie found him an hour later. She sat beside him silently. "She's not angry at you," she said finally. "She's angry at him. At me. At everyone who stayed silent when she begged for answers." Jacob nodded slowly. "She deserves truth," he murmured. Elsie reached into her bag and handed him a sealed envelope. She wrote that the day he died, for him, but now, it's for you. He held it like a live wire. "You sure you need to know?" Jacob opened the envelope that night. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy of a birth certificate. His. But under father's name, one word stood out, unknown. Beneath it, a scribbled note in Grace's handwriting. He made sure it stayed that way. Jacob felt his hands go cold. His whole life, he'd carried someone else's silence as if it were his own. He turned the paper over. Another note. "If you're reading this, then maybe the past finally broke free. I hope you find what I couldn't." The realization struck like lightning. Grace never hated him. She hated being invisible, forgotten, lied to. And now, she feared the same thing would happen to Jacob. The old man had buried not just his daughter, but his son too. All to preserve the illusion of control. Jacob folded the paper and whispered, "No more silence. Not from me." The next morning, Jacob returned to the bookstore. Grace was behind the counter, sorting returns. She didn't look up. He walked slowly, placed the birth certificate between them, and stepped back. "I read it," he said softly. "And I'm sorry." She paused. "Why are you here?" He exhaled. "Because I was silent once too. I never asked about my father. I didn't think it mattered. But now I know silence is how the damage hides." Grace looked up at him, her eyes red but strong. "You didn't choose this, neither did you," he said. "But maybe we can choose what comes next." She studied him, the paper between them like a bridge made of broken truth. "You still want to know me?" she asked. He nodded. "I need to." Grace didn't smile. But she didn't walk away either. That was enough. For now. They walked the river trail that evening. Not talking. Just listening to gravel crunch underfoot and wind rustle through the trees. Grace finally broke the silence. "He taught me how to whistle," she said. "Every Sunday after church we'd go to the field, and he'd say, 'Loudest whistle gets to pick dinner.' I never won, but I always got to pick." Jacob chuckled softly. "He taught me how to mend wire fencing, said broken things deserve second chances." They kept walking. "Did he ever mention me?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "No," Jacob admitted. "But he left pieces, like he wanted us to find each other when it was too late for him." Grace nodded slowly. "It still hurts," Jacob replied. "Maybe it's supposed to. Maybe pain's the price of knowing the truth." She didn't answer. But she didn't let go of his hand. They returned to the farmhouse days later. Together. Jacob unlocked the door, and Grace stepped inside for the first time in over 25 years. Her eyes wandered across the old furniture, the photos, the silence still hanging like a forgotten coat. "It smells the same," she said quietly. Jacob handed her the cassette. His last words, "I thought maybe you should hear them." She stared at it like it might burn her fingers. "I'm not ready," she admitted. "That's okay," Jacob said. Neither was I. She set the tape on the table and walked into the back room, her old bedroom. Jacob followed a moment later, finding her standing at the window. He kept everything, she whispered. Even the blanket I made in 4th grade. The air thickened. We were ghosts in his life, Grace said. Jacob replied, but we're not ghosts anymore. That night, Jacob stood outside under a sky heavy with stars, the farmhouse behind him glowing faintly with old light. Grace had gone to bed early. The silence pressed in. He pulled the cassette from his jacket and stared at it again. One last message. One final reckoning. Dot. He returned inside and placed the tape in the player. Click. Dot. Hiss. Then his grandfather's voice again. If you've come this far. I was wrong about silence. I thought it protected, but all it ever did was bury what should live. Jacob sat, heart clenched. I broke you before you were even born, and I broke Grace too. I told myself I was sparing you both, but I was only sparing myself from shame. The tape crackled. You have every right to hate me, but I pray you'll do what I never did. Say the truth. Live it, even if it hurts. Morning broke with a strange peace. Jacob stood in the field, dew soaking through his shoes. Grace joined him minutes later, arms crossed but eyes softer. Did you listen to it? She asked. All of it, Jacob replied. She looked down. I was scared too, me too. A bird shrieked in the distance. He wanted forgiveness, she said. But he never asked for it, he just left the pieces. Jacob nodded. He left the truth. That's something. Grace took a deep breath. I don't know if I can forgive him, but I don't want to carry him anymore either. Not like this. Then let's bury him, Jacob said. She blinked. He's already buried, not him, Jacob whispered. The silence. He reached into his coat and held out the cassette. Together, they walked back inside. Not to mourn, but to end a cycle. They built a fire behind the barn, just like he used to. Grace stacked the wood, while Jacob lit the match. The flame flickered, hesitant, like the emotions they carried. Jacob held the tape in his hands one final time. This isn't erasing him, he said. It's releasing us. Grace nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. He tossed the cassette in. It hissed, cracked, then melted into silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire roared louder. Grace stepped forward. He taught me to build fires, she said. But he never taught me how to let one die. Jacob replied, maybe that's what we're doing now. The flames danced, not with rage, but release. Grace wiped her eyes. We're not them, Jacob. He smiled faintly. No, we're not. And the fire burned, not in memory, but in cleansing. They cleaned the farmhouse the next day. Not to preserve it, but to prepare it. Photos taken down, old furniture shifted, letters boxed. Each item touched felt like peeling back another layer of history. In the attic, Grace found a locked chest. Inside were drawings. A child's, hers. Crayons on yellowing paper, each one labeled in the old man's handwriting. Grace, age 7, Grace, age 10. She stood motionless. He kept them, she whispered. Jacob touched her shoulder gently. He loved you. He just didn't know how to show it. Grace nodded slowly, eyes wet but calm. He thought keeping them meant something, but love's not storage, it's action. Jacob replied, then let's act, let's do what he couldn't. They looked around the attic. This place had been a tomb long enough. It was time to let the light in. They didn't keep everything. Some things had to go. But the house wasn't empty now. It was honest. That evening, Jacob and Grace sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea. The kind of silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. What now? Grace asked. Jacob smiled. We'll live. She chuckled. Is it really that simple? He looked around at the cracked walls, The warm light, the dusty memories reframed with truth. "It has to be," he said. "Or we'll stay unhappy like he did, like so many do." Grace took a long sip, nodded. "Then let's start here." They clinked mugs. Two strangers becoming siblings. Not because of the man who raised them in silence, but because they chose to rise above it. Outside, the wind shifted gently. And inside, for the first time in years, peace sat down at the table. Weeks passed. The house didn't change much, but the energy inside it did. Laughter replaced the tension. Conversations flowed without fear. Grace brought over fresh bread from the local bakery, and Jacob patched the porch steps. One morning, as they painted the back fence together, Grace turned and said, "I thought he ruined me." Jacob stopped. "He didn't," she continued. "He wounded me, but I'm the one who decided to keep bleeding." Jacob nodded, brush still in hand. "I did too. We both held on to hurt like it made us loyal." Grace exhaled. "But maybe the bravest thing we can do is choose not to stay broken." She dipped the brush again. "It's not about forgetting," Jacob said. "It's about finally being free." Thence gleamed white behind them. A clean surface. A place where something new could grow. That night, Grace showed Jacob an old journal. Her journal, filled with entries that began in childhood and continued through silent years. "I used to write letters to no one," she said. "I thought if I wrote it, it wouldn't hurt so much." Jacob flipped through the fragile pages. He stopped at one dated 2 decades ago. "I don't think he ever wanted me. I don't think he knows how much I needed him to fight for me." He closed the book gently. "Do you want to keep this?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "I want to write new pages." Together, they built a shelf for her to start over. A space not for what was lost, but for what could be created. This was not about rewriting the past. It was about reclaiming the future, one truth at a time. On what would have been Raymond's 89th birthday, they visited his grave. No fanfare. No speeches. Just a wildflower bouquet and a folded photo. The one of him, Elsie, and the daughter he never knew how to love. Grace placed the picture gently at the base of the stone. "You failed," she said. "But you also gave us a path to something better." Jacob stood silently, letting her words be the offering. "We didn't get a father," she added, "but we found a brother and a sister in the ruins." Her voice broke, but she didn't cry. Instead, she straightened and said, "Goodbye, Dad. Not because we hate you, but because we're done waiting for you to say what should have been said." Jacob whispered, "Rest now. We're moving forward." The wind stirred. Not cold this time, just present, like a quiet nod from the earth itself. Months later, the farmhouse opened its doors to more than memories. It became a writing retreat. Grace hosted workshops. Jacob tended the grounds. The house that once buried secrets now nurtured stories. People came from towns away, some to write, others just to feel understood. Grace stood in front of a small group one afternoon and said, "We tell stories not to escape the truth, but to make peace with it." Jacob smiled from the back. He hadn't spoken much during these sessions. But today he raised his hand. "Pain doesn't end because you uncover it," he said. "It ends because you decide it doesn't get to own you anymore." Heads nodded. Not in agreement, in recognition. This house had once held ghosts. Now it held healing. That was the inheritance they chose to build. One evening, Jacob found an old photograph tucked between the floorboards, one they'd missed. It showed Raymond as a young man, holding a baby girl wrapped in a crocheted blanket. "Grace," thought. He handed it to her. She stared at it for a long time. "He did hold me," she whispered. "At least once." Her hand trembled. He just didn't believe he deserved to again. Jacob said nothing. He just pulled a nail from the wall and hung the photo in the hallway. "We won't build altars," he said. "But we won't hide the truth either." Grace nodded. "Let people see who we came from and what we chose to become instead." The hall was quiet, but not empty. It held echoes, yes, but also footsteps moving forward. For the first time, their story wasn't buried. It was framed in full light and left there for others to learn from. Spring returned to the valley like a second chance. The fields behind the farmhouse bloomed wild lavender sunflowers and clover where nothing but silence once grew. Jacob stood at the edge of the porch, watching children from the retreat run through the tall grass. Grace came up behind him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "It's beautiful," she said. Jacob nodded. "It used to be a place people left. Now it's where they come to heal." Grace looked toward the barn. "We built something out of broken wood." "He never did," Jacob said softly. "But maybe we did it for him, or in spite of him. Either way, we didn't let it die." Grace smiled. "And we didn't stay unhappy." The wind picked up, brushing against their faces. Not cold this time, just real. Like truth. Like legacy finally given shape. And in one of the new workshops, Grace handed out blank notebooks. "You're here to tell your truth," she said. "But don't rush. The deepest stories take time to wake up." A woman in the back raised her hand. "What if it hurts too much to write it?" Grace answered. "Then write around it. Until it doesn't scare you anymore." Jacob watched from the side, his arms crossed loosely, pride flickering in his eyes. These people didn't come for answers. They came for permission, to hurt, to remember, to begin again. Later, one of the participants stopped Jacob outside. "Are you a writer too?" He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just someone who needed a story to understand himself." The man nodded. "Then you are." And Jacob realized, this wasn't just healing. It was continuation, for him, for Grace, and for everyone who walked through their door. That evening, they opened a memory box they hadn't touched, a small chest with Raymond's dog tags, a rusted harmonica, and an envelope marked, "For Grace." Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. It was short. I saw you from a distance more times than I deserved. I didn't speak because I thought I'd make it worse. But I was already the silence. You were never the problem. I was just never brave enough to be your father." Grace folded it slowly. "He never mailed it," she said. Jacob replied, "Maybe he couldn't." She nodded. "But he wrote it. And that mattered. Sometimes people find courage too late. But even late truths plant something." Grace looked up. "I'll keep this, not as closure, but as proof he wanted to try." The paper didn't erase the pain, but it gave it somewhere to rest. Years passed. The garden grew fuller. The walls inside the house faded less with grief and more with sun. Photos of smiling visitors now filled the hallway, people who came broken and left breathing lighter. Jacob stood at the mirror one morning, adjusting his collar. A child ran past the doorway laughing. Grace's adopted daughter. She'd named her Elsie. He smiled. Generations had shifted. The old pain no longer echoed, it whispered, softer each day. He looked at the small plaque near the front gate, the place where silence broke. Beneath it, Grace had engraved something else. "Most people stay unhappy because they never face what haunts them. We did." It wasn't pride that filled him. It was peace. The past didn't win. The silence didn't stay. The truth lived here now, out loud. On the anniversary of Raymond's death, Grace lit a candle on the windowsill. No speeches, no sorrow, just a flicker against the night. Jacob joined her, each holding silence like an offering, not to mourn him, but to mark the distance they'd traveled from who he was. "Do you still think of him?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "But now, I don't ache. I wonder." "About what?" Grace turned to him. "If he would have been proud." Jacob looked at the candle, then at her. "Of us, or of himself?" Grace smiled, bittersweet. "Maybe both." The flame danced gently, no longer burning, just glowing. The house behind them stood quiet, not heavy, not haunted, just full. Full of truth, full of choice. full of the people who refused to stay, unhappy. And as the wind brushed past the candle, it held, steady, like a final whisper that said, "You did it."